I wrote an essay in 1889 called The Gospel of Wealth. In it, I laid out a moral law, a simple principle that I believe should govern how the wealthy live and how they die. The man who dies rich dies disgraced. I meant it. I believed it. I built my entire philosophy of wealth around it. And almost no one followed it. Not then, not now, not ever. Let me tell you why. Let me tell you what this moral law actually means. And let me tell you why the wealthy ignore it, even though they know it is true. I became the richest man in the world in 1901 when I sold Carnegie Steel to JP Morgan for $480 million, the equivalent of hundreds of billions today. I was 66 years old. I had more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. I had proven everything I needed to prove. I had escaped poverty. I had built an empire. I had won completely. And I was faced with a question that most wealthy people never seriously ask themselves. What is all this money for? Not what can I buy with it? Not what comfort can it provide? Not what security can it guarantee? But what is its actual purpose? What is wealth supposed to do? What moral obligation comes with having more resources than you could ever personally need? Most wealthy people never ask this question because they are afraid of the answer, because the answer requires them to change how they live, how they think, how they see themselves, how they relate to their wealth. The answer I arrived at was simple but brutal. Wealth beyond what you need to live well is not yours to keep. It is a trust. You are a temporary steward. Your job is not to accumulate it. Your job is not to pass it to your children. Your job is to deploy it for the good of society before you die. This is the moral law of wealth. The man who dies rich dies disgraced, because dying rich means you failed in your duty as a steward. You hoarded what you should have distributed. You kept what you should have given. You died with resources that could have changed lives, but instead just sat in your accounts doing nothing. Let me tell you where this law came from. Not from religion, not from philosophy books, but from watching what wealth does to people who accumulate it without purpose. I watched wealthy men become miserable defending their fortunes, paranoid about people wanting their money, isolated because they could not trust anyone, consumed by the fear of losing what they had spent their lives building. I watched wealthy families destroy themselves fighting over inheritances, children who never worked becoming entitled and useless, grandchildren who never struggled becoming weak and dependent, great fortunes creating generations of people who contributed nothing to the world. I watched wealth concentrate in fewer and fewer hands while poverty spread in the streets outside the mansions. I watched the gap between rich and poor widen until it threatened to tear society apart. And I realized something. Wealth without purpose is not just wasteful, it is dangerous. Dangerous to the person who holds it, dangerous to the family that inherits it, dangerous to the society that allows it to concentrate without limit. This is the first truth about the moral law of wealth. Accumulation without distribution destroys everything it touches. The individual, the family, the society, everything. Most wealthy people do not see this because they are inside the accumulation. They are still building, still growing, still believing that more wealth will solve whatever problem they are trying to solve. But it does not. More wealth just creates more problems, more to protect, more to manage, more to worry about, more to fight over, more to defend, more to lose. At some point, accumulation stops being productive and starts being destructive. And most wealthy people never recognize when they cross that line. They just keep accumulating. Oh, until they die, and then they pass the destructive burden to their children who were never equipped to handle it. This is why I said the man who dies rich dies disgraced, not because having money is shameful, but because dying with money you did not deploy is a failure of duty, a failure of vision, a failure of moral courage. Let me tell you what I did with my wealth after I sold Carnegie Steel. I gave away 90% of it, $350 million. I built 2,800 libraries across America and the English-speaking world. I funded universities. I established research institutions. I created foundations for education and peace. I gave away my fortune systematically and strategically over 18 years until almost nothing was left. When I died in 1919, my estate was worth $30 million, down from over $500 million at its peak. I had given away more than 90% of everything I had accumulated. This is what the moral law requires. Not charity, not occasional giving, but systematic distribution of wealth beyond what you need. Methodical deployment of resources for public good. Strategic philanthropy that continues creating value long after you are gone. But almost no one does this. Not then. Not now. Let me tell you why. The first reason people do not follow the moral law is fear. Fear that they will not have enough. Fear that circumstances will change. Fear that they will need the money later. Fear that giving it away means losing control. Fear that distribution means vulnerability. I understand this fear. I felt it. When you grow up poor like I did, when you watch your family starve, when you experience powerlessness, you become terrified of returning to that state. Money feels like protection, like security, like the only thing standing between you and the poverty you escaped. So you hold on, you accumulate, you build buffers and safety nets and reserves. You convince yourself you need just a little more before you can start giving. Just a little more security, just a little more protection, just a little more buffer. But the more you have, the more you fear losing it. Wealth does not reduce fear. It increases it because now you have more to lose, more to protect, more to defend, more to worry about. This is a trap. The fear that makes you accumulate is the same fear that prevents you from distributing. And if you wait until the fear goes away before you start giving, you will never start. Because the fear never goes away. It just grows with your wealth. The moral law requires you to give despite the fear, to distribute even when it feels unsafe, to deploy resources even when you want to hold on, to act against your instinct for self-preservation, to trust that enough is enough even when fear says you need more. Most people cannot do this. The fear is too strong. So they die with fortunes they never deployed. And they call it being responsible, being prudent, being careful, but it is really just being afraid. The second reason people do not follow the moral law is ego, the belief that their children deserve their wealth, that their family has earned special treatment, that their heirs should benefit from their success. I understand this too. I worked hard for my money. I sacrificed. I took risks. I built something from nothing. Why should not my children benefit from what I built? Why should not my family enjoy the fruits of my labor? But this thinking is wrong, dangerously wrong, because inherited wealth destroys the inheritors. I have watched it happen over and over. The children of wealthy men who never had to struggle, who never had to build anything, who never had to prove themselves, who grew up believing they were special because they were born into money. They become weak, entitled, useless, they contribute nothing, they create nothing, they just consume what their fathers built, and they raise children who are even weaker, even more entitled, even more useless. Inherited wealth does not help your children, it cripples them. It robs them of the struggle that builds character. It denies them the challenges that create strength. It gives them resources without teaching them how to create resources. The greatest gift you can give your children is not money. It is the ability to create value, the skills to build, the character to persevere, the strength to face challenges. And you cannot give them these things if you give them money instead. This is why the moral law says, give your children education, give them opportunities, give them enough to be comfortable, but not so much that they never have to work, and give the rest away to people who need it, to institutions that multiply value, to causes that improve society. Your children do not need your millions. They need your values, your work ethic, your example. And they need the motivation that comes from knowing they have to build their own lives rather than living off yours. But most wealthy people cannot accept this. Their ego says their children are special. Their family deserves special treatment. Their legacy should benefit their bloodline. So they pass fortunes to children who are destroyed by them. And they call it love. But it is really just ego. The third reason people do not follow the moral law is addiction. Addiction to accumulation, addiction to the game, addiction to the scoreboard, addiction to more. I understand this too. I was addicted. For 40 years, I accumulated, I built, I expanded, I grew my fortune year after year, not because I needed more money, but because accumulation became my identity. Growth became my purpose. Building became the only way I knew how to measure my worth. This is what wealth does to people who chase it. It stops being a means and becomes an end. You are no longer accumulating wealth to do something with it. You are accumulating wealth because that is what you do. Because the number going up is how you know you are winning. Because more is how you prove you matter. This addiction is powerful, more powerful than drugs, more powerful than alcohol, because society rewards it. People praise you for being wealthy. They respect you for accumulating. They celebrate your success. They call you a winner. They ask for your advice. They want to be like you. So the addiction gets reinforced constantly. Every year your wealth grows, you get another hit of validation, another proof that you are special, another confirmation that you are winning, and you become dependent on that feeling, on that validation, on that proof of worth. And the thought of giving it away feels like dying, like losing yourself, like becoming nothing. Because if you are not accumulating, if the number is not growing, if you are not building wealth, then who are you? What are you? What is your purpose? This is why the moral law is so hard to follow. It requires you to give up your addiction, to find identity beyond accumulation, to measure worth by something other than net worth, to define yourself by what you give rather than what you have. Most people cannot do this. The addiction is too strong. The identity is too tied to the wealth. The sense of self is too dependent on the number. So they keep accumulating until they die. And they die as addicts, slaves to the very wealth they thought would free them. The fourth reason people do not follow the moral law is ignorance. Ignorance of what wealth can actually do. Ignorance of how to give effectively. Ignorance of the difference between charity and impact. Ignorance of how to multiply value rather than just transfer it. Most wealthy people who do give badly. They give to whatever asks. They give to feel good. They give without strategy. They give without understanding. They give without systems. They give without measuring impact. And their giving accomplishes little. It makes them feel generous, but it does not actually solve problems. It provides temporary relief, but not permanent solutions. It helps individuals, but does not change systems. It makes them popular, but does not create lasting value. This is not what the moral law requires. The moral law requires strategic deployment of wealth, systematic giving that multiplies impact, building institutions that continue creating value after you are gone, solving root problems rather than treating symptoms, creating systems rather than providing handouts. This is hard, much harder than just writing checks. It requires thought, strategy, understanding, systems, measurement, discipline, all the same skills that built the wealth in the first place applied to giving it away. Most wealthy people do not want to work this hard at giving. They worked hard to make the money. They want giving to be easy, so they give badly, without impact, without multiplication, without lasting value. And they wonder why their giving does not feel meaningful, why their philanthropy feels empty, why distributing wealth does not feel as satisfying as accumulating it felt. The moral law is not just about giving money away. It is about deploying wealth strategically to create maximum lasting value. It is about building institutions that educate generations, about solving problems that create opportunity, about multiplying impact so that every dollar given creates more value than it could create sitting in an account. This requires the same obsessive attention to detail that building wealth required, the same strategic thinking, the same measurement, the same optimization, applied not to accumulation, but to distribution, not to taking, but to giving, not to building wealth, but to deploying it. Most people do not understand this. So they give ineffectively, and then they use their ineffective giving as an excuse not to give more. They say philanthropy does not work, that money cannot solve problems, that the poor will always be poor, that giving is wasteful. But what they really mean is they do not want to work as hard at giving as they worked at taking. They do not want to apply the same discipline to distribution that they applied to accumulation. They do not want to measure impact the way they measured profit, so they die with their wealth. And they call it being smart, being prudent, being realistic. But it is really just being ignorant of what wealth can do when deployed with the same intensity that created it. Let me tell you what I learned by following the moral law, by giving away 90% of my fortune, by building thousands of libraries and funding universities and establishing institutions. I learned that giving away wealth is harder than making it. It requires more thought, more strategy, more discipline, more humility, more patience, more wisdom. I learned that the impact of well-deployed wealth is greater than the impact of well-accumulated wealth. That a library that educates thousands for generations creates more value than a fortune sitting in accounts. That institutions that multiply knowledge create more progress than individuals who hoard capital. I learned that dying with less money than I had at my peak did not make me poorer. It made me richer in meaning, richer in purpose, richer in legacy, richer in the knowledge that my wealth continued creating value after I was gone. I learned that the man who dies rich does not just die disgraced, he dies poor. Poor in everything that actually matters. Poor in purpose, poor in legacy, poor in meaning, poor in the knowledge that his life created lasting value. But I also learned why almost no one follows the moral law. because it requires things most people cannot give. It requires conquering fear when fear feels rational. It requires sacrificing ego when ego feels justified. It requires breaking addiction when addiction feels like identity. It requires learning new skills when you already succeeded at old ones. It requires you to change everything about how you think about wealth, about yourself, about your children, about your purpose, about what success actually means. Most people cannot do this. They cannot change that fundamentally. They cannot let go that completely. They cannot give that freely. They cannot trust that deeply. They cannot work that hard at distribution after working so hard at accumulation. So they ignore the moral law. They rationalize. They make excuses. They promise they will give later. They say they are not ready yet. They claim their children need it. They argue that they earned the right to keep it. They insist that wealth should be preserved. They believe they are being responsible by holding on, but they are wrong. And somewhere deep down, they know they are wrong. They know that dying with more money than they could ever use is a failure. They know that passing fortunes to children who did not earn them is harmful. They know that wealth without purpose is meaningless. They know the moral law is true. The man who dies rich dies disgraced. They know it, but they do not follow it, because following it is too hard, too scary, too costly, too different from everything they built their life around. I followed it. Not perfectly, not without struggle, not without doubt, but I followed it. I gave away 90% of everything I accumulated. I built institutions that outlasted me. I deployed wealth systematically for public good. I died with almost nothing compared to what I had. And I can tell you from the other side, from the end of the journey, from the place where you can look back and see your entire life clearly, following the moral law was the most important thing I did. More important than building Carnegie Steel. More important than becoming the richest man in the world. More important than any business success or financial achievement, because business success is temporary. Companies change hands. Fortunes are spent. Achievements are forgotten. But institutions last. Libraries last. Universities last. The impact of well-deployed wealth lasts. The legacy of systematic giving lasts. The man who dies rich dies disgraced, not because the money is bad, but because dying with money means you failed to do what the money was for. You accumulated resources you never deployed. You held power you never used for good. You had the opportunity to change lives and you chose to count money instead. This is the moral law of wealth. Simple to state, almost impossible to follow, true regardless of whether anyone follows it, ignored by almost everyone who should heed it. I'm telling you this not because I think you will follow it. Most people who hear it will not. Most wealthy people who know it is true will still ignore it. Most successful people will still die with more money than they deployed. But I am telling you because some of you might follow it. Some of you might hear this and realize it is true. Some of you might choose to live differently, to give systematically, to deploy wealth strategically, to build institutions that last, to die with less than you had because you gave it away rather than hoarded it. If you are one of those people, if you choose to follow the moral law, I am telling you it will be hard, harder than making the money, harder than building the business, harder than achieving success, harder than anything else you do. It will require conquering your deepest fears, sacrificing your ego, breaking your addiction to accumulation, learning entirely new skills, working as hard at giving as you worked at taking, thinking as strategically about distribution as you thought about accumulation, measuring impact as carefully as you measured profit. But I'm also telling you it'll be worth it. Not in money, not in comfort, not in security, not in anything you can measure on a balance sheet, but in everything that actually matters, in purpose, in meaning, in legacy, in the knowledge that your life created lasting value, that your wealth multiplied impact, that your fortune changed lives, that you died with less because you gave more. This is the moral law of wealth that no one follows. The man who dies rich dies disgraced. It is true. It has always been true. It will always be true. Whether anyone follows it or not, whether anyone believes it or not, whether anyone likes it or not, I followed it. I gave away 90% of my fortune. I built thousands of libraries and funded universities and established institutions that continue creating value a century after my death. I died with almost nothing compared to what I had, and I died fulfilled, purposeful, meaningful, rich in everything that actually matters. You can follow it too, or you can ignore it like almost everyone else does. You can rationalize and make excuses and promise you will give later and die with your fortune intact. You can pass your wealth to children who it will destroy. You can hoard resources that could change lives. You can die disgraced like almost every wealthy person does. The choice is yours. The moral law does not force itself on anyone. It just states the truth and waits to see who has the courage to follow it, who has the wisdom to understand it, who has the strength to live by it, who has the vision to see that dying rich is dying poor, that hoarding is losing, that accumulation without distribution is failure, that wealth without purpose is disgrace. I chose to follow the moral law. I gave away my fortune, I deployed my wealth, I built lasting institutions, I died with almost nothing, and I died rich. Richer than I ever was when I had $500 million, richer in meaning, richer in purpose, richer in legacy, richer in everything that survives death. That is the moral law of wealth that no one follows. Now you know it. What you do with that knowledge is between you and your conscience, but you cannot say you were not told. You cannot say you did not know. You cannot say no one explained it clearly. The man who dies rich dies disgraced. That is the law. Follow it or ignore it, but you cannot escape it because it is true whether you believe it or not, and you will face it eventually. When you die, when you look back at your life, when you see clearly what you did with your wealth, when you measure what you gave against what you kept, when you assess your legacy, when you understand what really mattered, and in that moment you will know if you followed the moral law or ignored it, if you died fulfilled or disgraced, if you were rich or poor, if your life mattered or was wasted, if your wealth created lasting value or just sat in accounts until someone else spent it. I hope you choose to follow the law. I hope you give systematically. I hope you deploy strategically. I hope you build institutions that last. I hope you die with less because you gave more. I hope you understand that wealth without purpose is poverty, that accumulation without distribution is failure, that dying rich is dying disgraced. But whether you follow it or not, the moral law remains true, and I have told you. Now you know, now you choose, now you live with your choice, just as I lived with mine, just as everyone who accumulates wealth lives with theirs, just as the rich who die disgraced live with ignoring it, just as those who follow it live fulfilled. The moral law of wealth that no one follows, except those with courage enough, wisdom enough, strength enough, vision enough, to see that giving is richer than keeping, that distribution is more valuable than accumulation, that dying with less means living with more. That disgrace is dying rich, and honour is dying having given it all away. That is the law. That is the truth. That is what I learned. That is what I followed. That is what I am telling you now. It is yours to follow or ignore. Choose wisely, because you only die once, and that moment reveals everything, including whether you understood the moral law of wealth or died disgraced like almost everyone else.